Dr. Andrea Charron.
Thank you, Tim. Those of you who have read the Government of Canada's 2017 Defence Policy Statement entitled Strong, Secure and Engaged will know that it commits that Canada will act as a responsible, value-added partner with NORAD, and it will work with the United States to ensure that NORAD is modernized to meet existing and future challenges. However, SSE provides little detail on what NORAD modernization means, and it really doesn't talk about resources required except for committing to buy a new fighter aircraft for the RCAF. And I'm sure you've all seen the recent news about what airplanes still remain in that competition. Our guest speaker this evening has studied the concept of NORAD modernization extensively and has published several thought-provoking papers on the issue. Dr. Andrea Charron is the director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba. Her academic credentials include a PhD from the Royal Military College of Canada, Department of War Studies, a master's in international relations from Webster University, Leiden in the Netherlands, a master's of public administration from Dalhousie University, and a Bachelor of Science with honors from Queen's University. She has worked for various federal departments, including the Privy Council Office in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. Dr. Charron has written extensively on the Arctic, on NORAD, on Canadian defense policy, and the United Nations Security Council. She is asked regularly to provide guest lectures at Canadian Forces College and to provide testimony to the Senate and House of Commons committees. And so we're honored to have Dr. Andrea Charron speak to us this evening about the implications of NORAD modernization for Canada, and hopefully with a little bit of emphasis on what it means for the Navy. So Andrea, I've turned you into presenter. You just need to turn on your microphone and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's I who is honored to be invited here today. In my youth, I was a laser sailor, and I spent most of my summers teabagged in various lakes across Canada. And it never ever occurred to me that one day I might be able to address the Canadian Naval Association. So I want to thank Tim Addison and Barry Walker and Ray Coutu for this very kind invitation. It's a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm also conscious that today, December 6th, is a very solemn occasion because we remember the 14 women who were killed at École Polytechnique almost 32 years ago. And the fact that violence against women and girls continues across Canada and around the world. And so I'd like to dedicate this talk to them and encourage all of us to think about how we can prevent this. And I hope this talk will be a reminder of the importance for women's voices and diverse voices on all of these topics, especially when it comes to defending North America. So I entitled my talk, Unpacking NORAD Modernization, because for a long time, we had this idea that things had to be modernized, but we really weren't sure what. And the natural inclination is to think, well, this is all about technology. When in fact, my bottom line up front is that this thing we call NORAD modernization is a whole host of steps, processes, new systems of systems, and a fundamental rethink about how we are going to defend North America, how we're going to make sure that we have the right information at the right time, and make for the first time the homeland the key focus of our defense efforts. And so I want to do this by doing four things. One, I want to just remind us all of the Canada-US defense relationship. I think sometimes we forget how it is that we are such important allied partners with the United States, because certainly it wasn't necessarily guaranteed if you look back in history. And just give you just a reminder of the mission suites of NORAD. Then I want to start unpacking this thing called NORAD modernization, and I want to pay particular focus on the seams and gaps challenge, which goes far beyond NORAD's remit, But because NORAD is twinned with one of the US combatant commands, and it is something that the US military is grappling with, it certainly will have ramifications for NORAD, Canada, and allies. And finally, I want to finish with this idea that we need to shift the thinking. For much of the Cold War, we assumed that deterrence was all about punishment, that threat of total nuclear annihilation, first strike capabilities. This was going to guarantee that the homeland was safe. Well, now that we have strategic competition, we have new peer competitors to the United States and new hybrid tactics being used, we need to shift our thinking, and especially this is what NORAD is doing, about going from deterrence as just punishment to deterrence as denial, upping the costs to adversaries, and contributing to what the United States wants, which is integrated deterrence and involving all allied partners around the world. So it's a big agenda, but I'm really excited to get tucked into it. So first, just to remind you about the origins of the Canada-US defense relationship, and hopefully you can see the two pictures there. We have President Roosevelt and our longest serving Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King. And the defense relationship really formed in about 1938 when Roosevelt was invited to Queen's University in Kingston by the then arts dean O.D. Skelton. And O.D. Skelton is one of Canada's really important bureaucrats whom is often overlooked. But he saw, as did Roosevelt, that the winds of war were looming, and that in this Second World War, North America was going to be a strategic player and could be at risk. And so invited Roosevelt to give a commencement address. And in the audience was William Lyon Mackenzie King. And FDR gave a very different speech, and especially one from any other US president in the past. Normally you say, you know, graduates, be good citizens and go out in the world and do great things. But instead, Roosevelt said the famous words, "The US shall not stand idly by if Canada comes under threat," or words to that effect. And William Lyon Mackenzie King was in the audience. He was really a little bit puzzled. This was unexpected. And he responded a few days later and said, in essence, "Thank you, but Canada pledges not to be a weak link or a backdoor to an attack on the United States." And so this pledge by the United States to protect Canada, to protect the US first and foremost, but also to protect an important geographic ally. And William Lyon Mackenzie King's promise not to require that protection and to keep the US safe was the defense pact for Canada and the US. Now, this isn't really sufficient because we like to write these things down. So FDR invited William Lyon Mackenzie King in 1940 to a train car just outside of Ogdensburg, New York on August 18th, 1940. And the two of them and a few aides penned this press release. And this press release formed what is now known as the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, which celebrated its 80th anniversary in 2020. And incidentally, just met again in June 2021 with the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Dr. Mara Carlin, and the Minister John McKay, Member of Parliament, John McKay, who are the co-chairs of this Permanent Joint Board on Defense. And the PJBD grapples with all sorts of issues of both defense and security, but ultimately giving advice to both President and Prime Minister on how best to defend and secure what we called North America, or the Western Hemisphere at that point. And so that commencement address, the response by William Lyon Mackenzie King, and this formation of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense formed the foundation of the Canada-US Defense Pact. Of course, then in World War II, Canada and the US became closer and operated together. And coming back then, realized that with the new threat faced in a Cold War by the Soviet Union, and the focus in particular on air-breathing threats, that Canada and the US would have to work together, because certainly the Canada-US border was not a defense against an attack by the Soviet Union, which over the Bering Straits is, less than 100 kilometers away. And so over time, an air defense pact was formed, which became what was then the North American Air Defense Command, and is now, thanks to technology, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. And this is a really unique organization. The only binational organizations in the world. There are 3 of them, and they are all between Canada and the US, which just goes to show how important this relationship is. The first binational organization is the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, but even before that, the International Joint Commission was formed, and its responsibility is to advise on protecting the Great Lakes that both Canada and the US share. The North American Air Defense Command is the 3rd binational institution. And binational is very different from bilateral. Bilateral means that Canada does things and the US does things, and together we can say that they're helping North America. But binational is Canada thinks not just about defending Canada, but defending the US and North America. And likewise, the US does the same. And so it's been described as a marriage. And this marriage has become now more complicated because after 9/11, the US created a combatant command for continental US. Imagine, until 2002, there was no dedicated US combatant command that was thinking about continental US. It was NORAD. And NORAD back then had only an air warning and an air control mission. But in 2002, when US NORTHCOM was formed, and there was never any question that NORAD wouldn't continue, which is quite, surprising considering that 9/11 was an intelligence failure on the part of many agencies in both Canada and the US. But it was also a particular failure of the NORAD key mission, which is to warn and defend against air threats. And it's because NORAD, for much of its history, has been oriented outward to search for threats coming from the approaches towards North America. There were very few of us that thought about the threats that could emanate from inside North America. So 9/11 has been very important to the history and transformation of NORAD, because it not only made us rethink about how NORAD should orient itself, not just outwardly facing, but also within North America. And we came up with things like the Operation Noble Eagle, which are special no-fly zones that you find particularly in the US, and also when there are major events across North America. But we got this thing called US NORTHCOM. And the commander of NORAD and US NORTHCOM is twin-hatted. And so he or she can be in charge of US NORTHCOM, which has a mission of homeland defense, defense support of civil authorities, or what we call assistance to other government departments in times of natural disasters and the like, and theater security cooperation. NORAD, the binational command that involves Canada, has an aerospace warning and aerospace control. As of 2006, when the agreement was signed in perpetuity, a maritime warning mission. And we'll talk a little bit about that, especially in your interests in all things Navy. But we also have the Canadian Joint Operations Command we also have to consider, and it's really a tri-command relationship. CJOC, of course, is in charge of all missions and exercises but those completed by NORAD and Special Forces. But given, for example, the maritime warning function and the fact that the maritime control features are still residing with national authorities, CJOC is very much involved, not only for DISCA-like or assistance to other government departments, but also when it comes to, for example, operations in the Arctic, because rarely are we talking simply about air threats, maritime warning. There are other security and defense considerations. So just to show you how special the relationship is, when the NORAD commander puts on his or her hat, he or she has the capability to reach up and speak to the Canadian Prime Minister via the Chief of the Defense Staff if there is a threat of concern. And on the US side, as the US NORTHCOM commander, he or she will report through the Secretary of Defense and up to the President. You note here that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is actually not in the direct chain of command when it comes to operations, but very, very important for things like force generation considerations. The other thing to note is that NORAD is not a force generator. It is a force employer, and it is both a supporting and supported command. A little bit different for US NORTHCOM and CJOC, of course, that also have some force generation roles. So this NORAD binational agreement, one of the stumbling blocks was the fact that it had to be renewed approximately every 5 years. And every time there was a renewal period coming up, there was great consternation, especially on the Canadian side, that perhaps the US would decide to just go it alone. They would sort of, do away with Canada, and we would lose NORAD. And the reason why NORAD is so essential to Canada is because it gives us direct insight into the strategic thinking of the US government. It gives us the ability to be there for training and other exercises, but of course, it's essential for us to be able to ensure that we are adhering to that promise that was made in 1938 and then solidified in 1940 to be joint partners in the defense of North America. So now, since 2006, we have 3 missions: aerospace warning, control, and maritime warning. When 9/11 happened, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld formed a binational planning group and said, Canadian and American, I want you to think about how we are going to defend the continental US and Canada in the future, given this extremist event. And I really encourage you to read the recommendations of the binational planning group, because they really were incredibly forward thinking. And they actually recommended that there's no reason, functionally speaking, why NORAD couldn't have a cyber mission, a maritime control mission, eventually land missions, especially when we consider climate change requires assistance on both sides of the borders. Storms and crisis events are getting so large, one military alone often isn't sufficient to respond. If you consider, for example, if we had a huge earthquake on the West Coast, it would probably cripple both Canada and much of the US Western coast. At the time, though, it was both the Royal Canadian Navy and the US Navy that were reluctant to accept a maritime control function. This was seen on both sides of the border as a bridge too far. And it also left a lot of people wondering, why is an air-centric command like NORAD dabbling in something like maritime warning? What could they possibly know? And this took a lot of education, and lobbying is perhaps not the correct word, but convincing the naval world that NORAD had an important role to play in maritime warning at the end of the intelligence stream as an intelligence fusion function, where NORAD could look with North American eyes on the approaches to North America to warn of any threats. Because what we often see in intelligence is, unless you have the big picture, the common operating picture, you may be looking for threats with your particular mandate and perspective in mind. And you might miss the warning signs that something else is happening because you were thinking through the lens of your institution, your point of view, rather than a North American point of view. And so this maritime warning is actually an example of the type of NORAD modernization that we need to do. It is a rethinking about what threats are coming at us in North America. How best do we leverage the fact that we have, the West has allies around the world with excellent capabilities, excellent sources of intelligence, and if we actually leverage all of that, it can be a force multiplier, and we can defeat our adversaries. Well, we're starting to think about that again, and so it started under General Jacoby, who was an Army general, who was a NORAD commander. He launched NORAD Next to think about what might be the threats coming at North America 25, 30 years down the road. And then under General Lori Robinson in 2016 and 18, she launched, with the blessing of the Permanent Joint Board of Defense, something called the Evolution of North American Defense Study. And this was to think about how Canada and the US, in all domains, so land, maritime, air, space, cyber, even the cognitive domains, those domains where mismal and disinformation can do so much damage. How is NORAD, US Northcom, and CJOC going to prepare for these new threats? Today, of course, we have two peer competitors, or near peer competitors, in the case of Russia, and China, of course, is the growing threat in the world. We have drones, and NORAD has always struggled with what they call this low and slow problem. Our radars, and we'll talk about the North Warning System, were created at a time when we had a particular air threat in mind, and now we have new threats. We have the rise of China and its domination in economics, which is going to have repercussions for Canada. And we have these new weapons called hypersonic weapons, which can travel at up to Mach 8. And what's so difficult with hypersonic weapons is that they can change direction. They're a little bit like ballistic missiles, and they can be a little bit like cruise missiles, but especially in the case of ballistic missiles, these hypersonic missiles can change direction. So you can't just do a mathematical calculation and say, oh, well, if we have a trajectory like this, we just need interceptors here, and we might have a chance of defeating the missile. Now it's skipping along the atmosphere and can change direction, and so it makes it very difficult to defend against. And then, of course, there are things like rare earth minerals, which are becoming increasingly important. All of these issues now, organizations like NORAD have to consider, because it's no longer sufficient to think about what is my mandate and my role, but what we have to think about is, how do these threats all work together, and how do both civilian, military, and allies work together so that we can increase the costs of adversaries so they don't hold North America to ransom. For a long time, the focus has been on the away game. and sending people overseas to protect North America. But now they're calling for a fundamental rethink. And the NORAD commander, Glenn Van Herk, has 3 goals. He wants all domain awareness, notwithstanding the fact that NORAD doesn't have missions in all domains, but we have to know what's happening in all the domains because it can have repercussions in the air and maritime domains. We need what's called information dominance, which means taking advantage of the fact that as Western allies, we have capabilities and sources of information from around the world, not only military, but other government departments, Twitter feeds, you name it. We need to be able to access all this information and then give it to the right people at the right time so that the commander can have decision superiority. We need to stay in the competition phase and avoid conflict. And so we're not thinking anymore along the lines of, well, we've always got deterrence by punishment as the ultimate weapon, still the case. But given the number of adversaries we have today and the ramifications of going to the punishment extreme, we want to be able to make decisions that can help to de-escalate situations, maybe create space for diplomatic discussions, and try and deter activities from the get-go. So here we have a picture of General Van Herk, who is our NORAD, and he is the US NORTHCOM commander. NORAD modernization tends to be thought of as just artificial intelligence, let's add some really cool new tech, and ta-da, we've modernized. When it's far more than that, it is things like, do we need a combined forces air component commander? Because if we are in a conflict situation and you have a commander who's not only the US NORTHCOM commander, but the NORAD commander and needs to be able to connect with the other combatant commanders and allies, including NATO, to decide how best to deal with a potential threat, he doesn't have also the time and energy and attention to deal with things like air tasking orders and literally, moving assets around North America. So one idea is maybe we need to contemplate a new position that deals with those sorts of things. It's coming up with new command and control configurations. For a long time, NATO allies have decided that these component commanders, domain specific, are very efficient. But in a world where we're trying to achieve joint all domain command and control, so we get that decision superiority, maybe dividing ourselves by domain specific organizations is not the right thing to do. So maybe we need to think about that. So it's all of these decisions, far more than just the technology. Nevertheless, the technology is going to be really important. And where we talk about NORAD renewal is actually North Warning System renewal. The North Warning System, as you probably know, was operational in the 1990s, but it was based on 1970s technology. It is a series of short and long range radars that stretch from Alaska through across the Canadian Arctic, down the eastern seaboard, and even a few in Greenland. And these short and long range radars were designed with a particular threat in mind, which was a Soviet Union Bear bomber going at a certain speed and a certain altitude, updated with algorithms to deal then with things like cruise missiles. But in today's world, with hypersonic missiles and with the placement of the radars, which are actually quite deep into Canadian territory, they're really not optimally placed to be able to see threats as far away from North America as possible. And so the North Warning System will not be replaced with some brand new singing and dancing system. It's going to be what we call a systems of systems. It's going to be updated in some cases. We're going to have new space capabilities added on, maritime feeds and capabilities. And so this system of systems is going to be part of the information dominance to collect all this information. The other side of not only collecting the information is also interpreting it. And this is where you may have heard of things like the Pathfinder initiative and other artificial intelligence-based systems and algorithms that take the information that the North Warning System is actually collecting, but our analysts don't see all of the patterns that the North Warning System is picking up because of the algorithms that we use to interpret the information. And as the air picture gets more and more congested, now we have thousands and thousands of drones to deal with, and we don't know which are nefarious and which are just, you know, kids with new toys, and new air threats and more civil aviation traffic. We need both the analysts, the algorithms, the cloud computing to collect all this information, much of which comes from civil organizations like the FAA and NAC Canada, and new technology like upgraded radar systems to be able to get this information and then get it to the right people at the right time. I want to turn to NORAD's Maritime Warning Mission because I think navies are really special and very important. And I think one of the reasons is because they are always globally projected. Most navies spend little time in sort of internal and territorial waters. They're out in the international seas. And so they have a very strategic view on the world. And this is where NORAD's Maritime Warning Mission, I think, is so important, but so undervalued. And anything we can do to draw attention to it and the importance of it is going to be key to organizations like NORAD embracing these new domains. So the NORAD Maritime Warning Mission was added in 2006. And the idea was that given the violent extremist threats that the Islamic terrorists posed, if they could have a vessel of interest, you could load it with all sorts of lethal weapons, and they might be missed or forgotten, or be able to come right into a port of call within North America and then launch an air threat or chemical weapons, or you name it. And so NORAD took on this Maritime Warning Mission, which I have to stress is at the end of the intelligence food chain. The Marine Security Operations Centers, especially in the East Coast through Trinity, create a Canadian Maritime Operating Picture, which it shares with NAV North, the naval arm of US Northcom, which adds more information and then sends this common operating picture to NORAD to have a look at with fresh eyes. Now, in many cases, if there has been any kind of a naval threat, it's been dealt with bilaterally or unilaterally by the RCN, the Coast Guards, the US Navy. But every once in a while, it's helpful to have NORAD have a look at the picture, because NORAD has a global area of operations when it comes to warning and surveillance. They can warn of ships that are, for example, leaving Indonesia, which may be bringing migrants, and we need to warn or advise other government departments to set up processing for them. Or in a time of a pandemic, track vessels that might be harboring people who are infected with a virus, and maybe we want to set up some sort of quarantine before they disembark in North America. Now, the first warning came in 2010, so a good 4 years after NORAD took on the mission. And that's because, you know, this was an air-centric institution taking on a naval function. And so I think tremendous respect and credit needs to be given to those first Canadian and American naval and U.S. Coast Guard personnel who really shaped and formed how it was that we were going to warn and advise of these threats. The first one was the Sun Sea, which was carrying Sri Lankan migrants. A warning was too strong a categorization of the problem. It had been missed by many of the intelligence agencies in Canada and the US. And so NORAD adopted this advisory where they can advise either Canada, US, or both at the same time that there might be a vessel of interest. It's up to the national authorities to take action. But it's done a few things. One, it's brought this very big maritime community together through conference calls to share best practices. It's led to, for example, a common lexicon of vessels of interest so that the Coast Guard and Navy and Transport Canada and other agencies can talk to each other about a vessel of concern without prejudicing future court cases and giving away private information. So NORAD's evolution, its modernization back in the time after 9/11 is actually an important lessons learned for us about how NORAD has to rethink itself going forward to modernize for the new threats we're facing now. The other thing with NORAD modernization is sometimes it's just a reconfiguration on a map. In 2018, for example, Canada changed its air identification zone so that it no longer matched where the North Warning System was located, which is these green sort of bubble-like lines you can see. That was sort of the extent of the North Warning System, and that's where our air identification zone sort of began. Finally, in 2018, we realized, well, it doesn't make sense to allow planes to be deep inside of Canada without being able to have that identification zone. And so we reconfigured our map, and so now it extends to the full territory of Canada. So that's another example of modernization that we often don't think about, but it's a rethinking of how we defend Canada and therefore North America. It's even down to the interceptors that Canada needs to make a decision on because our CF-18s are aged and not of the right generation to defeat the new threats we have. Another thing we need to do is think about climate change, both the role militaries are going to play in the crisis management. It's more than 50% of Canadian Armed Forces missions now are dedicated to missions and exercises in Canada, in North America, and many of them are a result of dealing with a crisis event associated with climate change. It's also about getting that balance between who should be providing that crisis management for how long. It's going to be part of a whole discussion because, again, NORAD doesn't operate on its own. It has US Northcom and it has CJOC. And CJOC and US Northcom increasingly are being involved in things like Operation Lentis, Operation Vector. It's support at home. How then are we going to navigate these different missions? The US has done a pivot to the Arctic every one of their services now has a strategy on the Arctic, which is a bit perplexing considering they don't have a strategy for the Middle East or for Africa, but now all of the services have a strategy for the Arctic. It means that the Arctic is important to the US, but not as important as Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region. But again, Canada needs to operate with them in the Arctic and needs to be able to deconflict in some cases, but also collaborate together so that we can maximize the limited infrastructure that we have in the Arctic by working together, not only on warning of approaches into the Arctic, but through the Arctic, and also support to local communities. And finally, I want to turn to the seams and the gaps problem, because this is part and parcel of a wider effort by the US military, and it's going to come out in their new strategy about how they're going to get the commands, and we have to drop the adjective geographic and functional. We're not supposed to use those adjectives anymore, but the fact is the US carves the world geographically and into these commands like transportation and strategic command that do certain things globally. Along these seams that separate the command's areas of responsibility are perfect places for adversary to probe and take advantage that you've often got commands that are focused or their attention is elsewhere. And when you look at the different seams, they were purposely set up sort of in the middle of the oceans, where of course our navies will be. But the thought was that in the middle of these oceans, there was going to be less of a chance of there being difficulties with these seams. There's also the problem of the gaps. Which commands have which capabilities? And we want to make sure that the right capabilities are in the right area of responsibility under the right commander at the right time. This was sort of the thinking of before. But now we have threats coming at us in 360 degrees in all domains simultaneously. And so we cannot think about each little command being its own fiefdom with its own resources and not paying attention to what's happening in other commands. And this has especially been the preoccupation of successive US NORTHCOM commanders who have felt that the other co-commands are not paying enough attention to the homeland, because the thinking was that the real threats, the real concerns were in the Middle East, or they were in Indo-Pacific COM. But now we realize by not paying enough attention to the homeland, we can be exploited and we can actually be defeated, because our resources, many of our resources come from North America. If adversaries can pin us down at home so that we cannot resupply other commands, other missions, we are going to be in a lot of trouble really quickly. And the Arctic is a particular problem because you not only have US NORTHCOM, EUCOM, and US INDOPACOM, which all have areas of responsibility in the Arctic, but you also have, for example, Alaska, which has capabilities for what it needs to do for US NORTHCOM are actually owned by US PACOM. And US EUCOM, because it has Russia in its area of responsibility, is sort of the lead on how to deal with Russia in an Arctic context, except for that US NORTHCOM has a lot of experience dealing with Russia because of the Bering Strait, and US NORTHCOM has been the Arctic capabilities advocate for the US military. So thinking through these seams and gaps, and of course, this also includes NORAD's area where it operates, but it also includes its global area for warning purposes. And of course, we have Canada involved in NORAD, and there's also NATO now thinking about how it's going, what strategy it will have for the Arctic. So making sure that that NORAD NATO scene and operations also complement and work together. This is especially the case for what's called the Greenland-Iceland UK-Norway gap. In the Cold War, as you know, this was a very strategic area. This was the main way to go from the North Atlantic into the Arctic, and especially to the Russian fleet in the Arctic. And we used to have a dedicated position in NATO, the SACLANT position, that focused specifically on this area. In the peace dividend, we did away with the area, but we're now realizing we need it back. And it's come back in a new form. It's come back with the reconstitution of the Second Fleet, and NATO has twinned that commander with the NATO Forces Command in Norfolk. And their areas are the North Atlantic and the Arctic to survey, do reconnaissance on the activity that is happening in this once again very important and strategic area of the world. And NORAD, of course, can have a role to play in terms of maritime warning, but also making sure that North America is well defended so that we can concentrate on where we best need our capabilities. The last part about NORAD modernization, and again, it goes beyond NORAD, but to all Western allies, is this shift in thinking from punishment as the ultimate resort to prevent conflict to deterrence by denial. And this is especially when the homeland comes in. If we can't warn of threats to North America, if we don't know what's happening in the land, sea, air, space within North America, we can be held ransom. We can be held at risk at home. And so it's about upping the cost to adversaries so that they understand that the defense of North America is as important, if not more so, than other parts of the world, because of course it is the homeland. This means that this shift in thinking to denial puts the focus not just on defeat mechanisms, but also on denying actions. So that means upgrading the North Warning System so that we can see new patterns of activity, so that we have that information to be able to make decisions to deter a potential attack before it's too late. And all of this speaks to the ultimate goal of the US military with all allies to have integrated deterrence across all domains, this JADC2, joint all-domain command and control, where we keep any competition that we have with adversaries in all of the domains and all of the various activities, political, economic, you name it. We need to keep it in the cooperation and healthy competition part of the continuum and prevent an escalation to conflict. And that's the real concern in today's environment, that a misunderstanding or an incident or an accident might escalate tensions so quickly that we find ourselves in the conflict range far too quickly. And because conflict today is going to be come as you are, we're not going to have the time or the luxury to ramp up production systems and have a fleet, sort of go across the Atlantic to aid Europe. It's going to be over like that. And probably the first time we know that we're in conflict is when we all try to go to an ATM and can't get money out. Because the way that we're being probed and attacked now is more subtle. It's below the threshold of conflict. So it's being chipped away at before you even realize that we have a problem. And so the goal of the US military and allies, including NATO and NORAD, is to be able to detect and deter, defeat, of course, but keep all of this activity as much as possible in a cooperation and competition zone and prevent conflict from escalating. And I will leave it there. That, in a nutshell, is NORAD modernization. If you take away one message, it's that NORAD modernization is about so much more than NORAD, and it's about so much more than just adapting new technology. It is about a fundamental rethink of what it means to defend North America.
Whoa,